For more than 1,000 years, travelers approaching Constantinople felt the same quiet shiver. The city did not rise from the earth so much as it seemed to drift above it, layered in stone and memory, wrapped in the calm confidence of a place that had outlived everything sent to break it. Even from a distance, its walls gave the impression of endurance beyond reason. Sunlight slid across battered ramparts that had faced emperors, crusaders, plagues, and storms, yet still stood as if time itself had learned to step carefully around them. To arrive at Constantinople was to feel history breathing, slow and steady, as though the city carried its centuries like a cloak that never grew heavy. People who lived within those walls inherited a strange inheritance. They walked streets paved by ancestors they would never know, beneath domes that had seen worlds rise and vanish. The city's survival had woven itself into their imagination. Collapse was not a possibility. It was a story for other civilizations, the ones without divine favor or indestructible stone. Here, the past did not feel distant. It pressed gently against the present, whispering that endurance was a natural state and that tomorrow would always resemble yesterday. But beneath that, calm certainty was something subtler. The more the city survived, the more its people believed survival was automatic. Siege after siege had broken against its walls, leaving behind the comforting illusion that Constantinople was not merely protected, but chosen. And when a culture begins to believe it cannot fall, it stops listening for the faint sounds of strain beneath its own weight. It stops noticing the soft cracks forming in the foundations, hidden under the familiar rhythm of daily life. It grows old without realizing it. As dusk settled over the city, the stones glowed with the dim warmth of fading sunlight, as if absorbing one last memory of day before night returned. There was no sign that the world around it had changed, that other powers were rising with ambitions sharper than any seen before. The city felt eternal, untouchable, suspended in the quiet certainty that nothing could truly challenge its throne. Yet, even the longest-lived giants forget how fragile they become. And Constantinople, wrapped in the comfort of its own legend, was about to discover how dangerous immortality feels when tested. This illusion of eternal safety will deepen when we step closer to the walls themselves, the very barriers that shaped the city's fate. For centuries, anyone approaching Constantinople first saw the Theodosian walls rising out of the landscape like the spine of an ancient creature. 3 layers of fortification stood shoulder to shoulder, built not as mere defences but as a declaration. They were wide enough for chariots to race across, tall enough to cast long shadows over enemies who had marched for months just to fail beneath them. Siege after siege washed against these stones like waves against a cliff, only to break and fade. Goths, Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Crusaders, each came with fire, with numbers, with promises of victory. Each left behind nothing but silence and the certainty that these walls were beyond human challenge. Over time, the walls stopped being seen as construction and became something closer to fate. Children grew up hearing stories of armies that had collapsed at their base. Elders spoke of stones that had outlasted plagues and tempests. Generations learned to trust the walls more than politics, more than allies, more than emperors themselves. Even when the empire shrank, even when wealth thinned and borders crumbled, the city still believed it was sheltered by something eternal. Strength repeated often enough began to feel like destiny. But the quiet danger of living behind invincible walls is that the mind begins to adopt their stillness. When no enemy succeeds, the need to innovate fades. When every previous threat has failed, future threats are softened into familiar shapes. The Byzantines came to view their defenses as a permanent truth, not a temporary advantage. And history has a gentle way of punishing those who confuse the two. The walls that once demanded vigilance slowly encouraged complacency. Repairs grew slower, strategies older, confidence heavier. Outside the empire, new powers rose with new weapons. But inside the city, time moved differently. The great fortifications had done their job too well. They had protected the empire from the world, but they had also shielded the empire from recognizing how quickly the world was changing. Standing before the Theodosian walls in the final years, one might still feel awe at their scale, their scars, their quiet endurance. Yet beneath that awe lived an unsettling truth. The city trusted the stones more than it trusted itself. And while the walls held firm, the people behind them were beginning to drift into a slow, unspoken, unraveling one that would reveal itself in the shadows of the next chapter. In the final decades before the fall, Constantinople still appeared whole. Sunlight spilled across its domes each morning as merchants lifted their shutters, and the familiar hum of markets rose like a ritual the city had performed for 1,000 years. From a distance, nothing seemed wrong. The streets carried the same rhythm. The bells of churches echoed through narrow alleys, and travellers still paused in awe when they stepped beyond the ancient gates. Life continued with a quiet steadiness, as though the city believed repetition alone could hold back the tide of time. Yet beneath this surface, calm, something subtle had begun to shift. Ships entered the harbour a little less often, their sails fewer than they once were. Some districts felt strangely quiet, their windows shuttered not because of danger, but because families had slipped away in search of better fortunes. Trade routes that once brought wealth from every corner of the world had slowly bent toward rising powers, leaving the city's storerooms less full each passing year. Even the markets, lively as they seemed, carried faint signs of thinning abundance: smaller piles of grain, fewer spices, merchants speaking in tones just a shade too hopeful. But the most telling change was the one almost no one mentioned. Conversations in taverns carried hints of uncertainty, stories of distant kingdoms growing bolder, rumours of armies gathering far beyond the horizon, and soft murmurs that the world was shifting in ways the old empire no longer understood. These whispers drifted through the city like a breeze that brushed past without drawing attention, easily dismissed by citizens who had inherited centuries of reassurance. After all, hadn't Constantinople always endured? Hadn't every threat, no matter how fearsome, eventually faded? The quiet erosion continued unnoticed. Repairs were postponed, alliances loosened, and the confidence of the past settled over the city like a warm blanket, comfortable but blinding. Each day felt normal, but each normal day carried the empire one step closer to the edge it could no longer see. The city wasn't falling. It was drifting, gently, into the soft twilight between memory and illusion. This was the calm that comes before understanding, the stillness that hides the first threads of unraveling. And as the city leaned unknowingly toward its final chapter, its greatest weakness was not the world outside its walls, but the quiet complacency taking root within. By the 15th century, Constantinople carried its age the way an elderly monarch carries a crown gracefully, but with a weight that could no longer be ignored. The empire had once moved with the quickness of youth, shaping laws, alliances, and armies with an energy that startled its rivals. But the centuries had stretched long, and time had settled deeply into its institutions. What had once been flexible became ceremonial. What had once been sharp became cautious. The empire still stood, still wore its history proudly, yet every year it moved a little slower, like a wise elder whose steps remained steady but no longer swift. Diplomacy, once the empire's greatest weapon, reflected this aging most clearly. Byzantium had mastered the art of survival by negotiating, deceiving, persuading, and outlasting its enemies. But as the world changed, its strategies remained anchored in older rhythms. Envoys still carried messages across familiar routes, but the nations receiving them were no longer the same. New powers had risen restless, ambitious, and unwilling to treat Byzantium as the pivotal force it once had been. The empire wasn't ignored, but it was no longer feared. Its voice still spoke, but the world around it had stopped listening with the same urgency. The people felt this shift in subtle ways. Markets were quieter, churches more solemn, conversations tinged with a kind of gentle fatigue. Citizens who once felt protected by the pulse of an eternal city now carried a more resigned confidence. The quiet pride of inheritors who knew the glory of their ancestors but sensed they themselves lived in the afterglow. They were not defeated. They were simply tired. Tired of watching borders shrink, tired of waiting for allies who never came, tired of believing that endurance alone could hold back the tide of change. None of this was the fault of one ruler, one decision, or one moment. It was the slow accumulation of centuries. Wars survived, victories spent, innovations postponed, burdens carried too long. Empires age the same way people do, not through sudden collapse, but through a gradual softening of strength. And Constantinople, once the radiant heart of the ancient world, had grown old without admitting it. As its walls stood tall, and its domes caught the fading light, A new power was rising beyond the horizon, one that did not share the city's nostalgia, and one that felt no reverence for the legends guarding its gates. Long before he stood at the gates of Constantinople, Mehmed was a boy shaped by contrasts raised between the softness of palace gardens and the hard expectations of an empire hungry for expansion. From childhood, he carried a name heavy with prophecy. His tutors taught him poetry, philosophy, languages, and war with equal seriousness, as though each discipline might carve a different path toward his future. Yet, even at a young age, he understood that he was not being prepared to rule quietly. He was being prepared to complete a story that had remained unfinished for 1,000 years. He grew up hearing tales of the city across the water, the city no conqueror had ever claimed. Constantinople was not described to him as a distant prize, but as a missing piece, something that belonged to the Ottomans by fate, if only someone bold enough reached out to take it. While other princes studied the history of victories, Mehmed studied the history of failures. Every siege the Byzantines had survived, every assault that had collapsed against the ancient walls. He wanted to know why those who came before him had faltered, and how he might avoid their mistakes. Loss entered his life early. The deaths of family members and the instability surrounding his father's reign left him with a sharp understanding of how fragile power could be. Yet instead of producing caution, these experiences fueled his determination. He began to treat destiny not as something granted by lineage, but as something built through relentless study and unshakable will. Those around him noticed the intensity in his eyes, a quiet fire that seemed too fierce for someone so young. When he briefly ascended the throne as a teenager, the world judged him inexperienced, unprepared, easy to dismiss. But inside the young ruler, the hunger for legacy only deepened. He returned to study with even greater discipline, absorbing military science, diplomacy, mathematics, and the art of siegecraft. He watched the world shift, saw empires weaken, and understood that timing mattered as much as strength. By the time Mehmed inherited the throne a second time, he no longer saw Constantinople as a fortress to fear. He saw it as the final chapter of a story he had been reading his entire life, a chapter he intended to write himself. To understand how he planned to achieve this destiny, we must now turn to the empire he inherited, a rising machine built for conquest. By the time Mehmed returned to the throne, the Ottoman Empire no longer resembled the fractured powers that surrounded it. It had become something far more disciplined, far more focused, a living machine whose strength grew with every campaign. Across the empire, training grounds echoed with the steady rhythm of marching boots. Young soldiers rose before sunrise, moving in perfect unison, their steps beating a pattern that felt less like preparation and more like destiny. This was not an army built on scattered traditions. It was an institution shaped with intention, sharpened by discipline, and unified by belief. At the heart of this system stood the Janissaries, an elite corps unlike anything the world had seen. They trained from childhood, learning obedience, endurance, and precision with almost ritual calm. Their loyalty was not tied to local lords or shifting politics, but to the Sultan himself, making them the most dependable force in the empire. Watching them move together, silent, focused, unbreakable, one could sense the quiet power of a military built not on numbers alone, but on cohesion. Beyond the battlefield, the Ottoman administrative system worked with the same relentless efficiency. Governors, tax collectors, scholars, architects, and diplomats all seemed to move in coordinated harmony, each contributing to the empire's expanding reach. Roads connected provinces with surprising speed, new cities rose along trade routes, and the treasury swelled as conquered lands folded seamlessly into the imperial structure. Everything, from the way decisions flowed from the palace to the way supplies reached distant armies, reflected a state that understood the value of organization. But the strength of the Ottomans went deeper than structure. It lived in the cultural confidence spreading across the empire, an energy felt in its courts, its markets, its academies. Conquest did not exhaust the Ottomans, it fueled them. Every victory strengthened their identity, and every new territory widened their sense of possibility. Compared to this rising force, Byzantium's defences felt like relics from a slower age. Constantinople was no longer facing scattered invaders, but a system designed to adapt, improve, and grow stronger with every passing year. A system carried by young ambition rather than ancient memory. And at the centre of this momentum stood a ruler prepared to reshape the world, armed now with an innovation powerful enough to challenge even the city's legendary walls. Long before the first stone of Constantinople's walls ever cracked, a quiet revolution was unfolding far from the city's gates. Across Europe and the Near East, gunpowder was beginning to whisper its way into the art of war. What had once been a world of swords, arrows, and patient siege towers was shifting into something louder, heavier, and far less forgiving. The old rules of medieval warfare no longer fully applied. A new sound was emerging, deep, resonant, and final, and it would carry far enough to reach the greatest fortress of the ancient world. At the center of this transformation stood a man named Urban, a skilled Hungarian engineer whose knowledge of casting large cannons bordered on genius. He traveled first to Constantinople, offering his abilities to the Byzantine court, but the empire, worn thin by debt and hesitation, could not provide the resources he required. Urban left disappointed, carrying with him a design that could have reshaped the city's future. Instead, he carried it somewhere else. When he reached Mehmed's court, everything changed. The young sultan listened closely, recognizing the significance of Urban's craft with the clarity of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. Mehmed gave him funds, materials, laborers, whatever he needed, and in the dim glow of furnaces, Urban began to forge the weapon that would alter the balance of centuries. The great bronze cannon rose from molten metal like a creature pulled from fire. Sparks flew across the workshop floor, casting brief constellations around the workers. The air trembled with heat, and the slow pulse of hammer strikes echoed like a heartbeat. When the cannon finally cooled and hardened, it stood as a silent promise, massive, dark, and patient. Its first test shook the earth. A blast thundered across the plain, rolling through the hills like a storm breaking open. Stone shattered, dust rose in a cloud that drifted for minutes. Those who witnessed the explosion felt a familiar world tip slightly, as though history itself had shifted under their feet. Mehmed watched in stillness, realizing he now possessed a tool capable of challenging the very myth that protected Constantinople. No longer was the city defended by the certainty of unbreakable walls. A new age had arrived, loud, unforgiving, and ready to decide the fate of empires. With this power in hand, Mehmed began crafting the strategy that would turn possibility into destiny. Before Mehmed marched a single soldier toward Constantinople, he began by studying the ghosts of every army that had failed before him. He examined the patterns of old sieges, the way a scholar might study a forbidden text quietly, patiently, searching for the lines others had missed. Where past commanders saw an unbreakable fortress, he saw a puzzle. Every weakness, every neglected approach, every misjudged tactic was gathered into his mind until the city's defenses no longer seemed legendary, only incomplete. He understood the first rule of conquest: reshape the battlefield before the enemy even realizes it has changed. Along the Bosporus, he razed the fortress of Rumeli Hisara, its towers rising like clenched fists above the strait. From this position, he could choke the city's supply lines with ease, turning water into a barrier instead of a passageway. The great cannons were forged and tested, their thunder echoing through the hills, rehearsing the destruction they would soon bring. Fleets were gathered, crews trained, and engines of war assembled with relentless precision. Mehmed's preparations stretched beyond weapons and fortifications. He worked to isolate the Byzantines diplomatically, severing threads of support before they could tighten into alliances. Letters were sent, agreements crafted, borders secured. European powers fractured, preoccupied, uncertain, found little room or will to interfere. By the time Constantinople understood how alone it truly was, Mehmed's plan had already tightened around it like a slow-moving tide. What made his strategy remarkable was not merely its ambition but its completeness. He anticipated counterattacks, studied the terrain around the walls, and envisioned how defenders might respond. Scouts mapped the land in intricate detail, marking soft ground, broken stone, hidden approaches. Engineers analyzed the ancient fortifications, identifying the points most vulnerable to sustained artillery fire. Every detail, no matter how small, became a piece of a larger design. To outsiders, it looked as though Mehmed was preparing for war. But to those who watched closely, it felt more like a ceremony. Each step deliberate, each decision precise, each movement arranged to bring an ancient story to its final line. By the time the Ottomans approached the walls, the outcome no longer felt uncertain. The city that had once outlasted empires now faced a ruler who had already conquered it in his mind. And inside those walls, the defenders were preparing for a final stand they sensed would test not only their strength, but their very spirit. By the time Constantine XI Palaiologos took the throne, the empire he inherited was less a kingdom and more a memory wrapped in stone. He knew this from the moment he placed the crown upon his head. The weight he carried was not symbolic. It was the accumulated ache of centuries, the lingering echoes of rulers who had once commanded continents. He stood not at the height of Byzantine glory, but at its fading edge, a solitary figure asked to guard the final ember of a world almost extinguished. His childhood had prepared him not for triumph, but for endurance. Born into a family marked by decline, he learned early that leadership meant holding together what time was determined to pull apart. He was educated in the old traditions, warcraft, diplomacy, history, yet each lesson carried a shadow, reminding him that the empire's best days had passed long before he drew breath. Still, those who knew him spoke of a quiet strength, a steadiness that did not seek admiration but offered reassurance. He was not a man of grand speeches or sweeping ambitions. He acted with a simpler, deeper conviction, to protect what remained for as long as he could. In the palace, he walked hallways lined with fading frescoes, their colours softened by centuries. Outside, he looked upon a city still beautiful but worn, its domes cracked, its neighbourhoods emptying, its walls holding stories older than any living soul. He understood the solitude of his position. To be the last emperor meant to feel every failure of the past pressing gently against your back, while every uncertain tomorrow waited in silence before you. And yet he never wavered. When news of Mehmed's preparations reached him, he did not curse fate or surrender to dread. Instead, he tightened his resolve. He toured the defences, spoke with soldiers, listened to the concerns of citizens who saw in him not a distant ruler, but a man standing with them at the edge of the unknown. His courage was not loud. It was the kind that settles quietly in the chest and stays there, steady and unshaken. Constantine XI faced the coming storm, knowing history would remember him not for victory, but for the dignity with which he met the inevitable. And beyond his lonely crown stood an army as fragile and diverse as the empire itself awaiting its final call. The defenders of Constantinople were not an army in the traditional sense. They were a mosaic of lives pulled together by circumstance, belief, and a final shared duty to a city older than memory. Greeks filled the battlements beside Venetians. Genoese captains stood shoulder to shoulder with monks who had never touched a weapon until the siege began. Merchants, craftsmen, and boys barely old enough to hold a shield answered the call, not because they believed victory was possible, but because surrender felt unthinkable. Each dawn, as the sun brushed the ancient walls with pale light, these unlikely companions took their places along the ramparts, knowing that the day might demand more strength than they had left. The empire's fractured alliances were visible in their ranks. Old tensions simmered quietly, Latin against Greek, Catholic against Orthodox, but the sound of Ottoman drums beyond the walls made these divisions soften, if only for a time. Men who once distrusted each other now passed waterskins along the parapets, exchanged tired smiles, and murmured brief words of encouragement before returning to their posts. In that fragile unity, the defenders found something rare, the understanding that shared danger can stitch together even the most frayed bonds. Everywhere, the emotional weight of their effort pressed gently against the senses. Hammers echoed through the night as volunteers patched cracks in the walls with whatever stones they could find. The scent of burning oil drifted through narrow streets. Inside dim churches, families whispered prayers over flickering candles, asking for strength, mercy, or simply a little more time. No one spoke of triumph. Their hope was quieter than that hope for another sunrise, hope that the next cannon blast would not be the one to tear open the ancient defences. Despite their limited numbers and dwindling supplies, the defenders carried themselves with a steadiness born not of confidence, but of necessity. They knew the walls were weakened, the enemy growing stronger, and the world beyond the city indifferent to their fate. Yet they stood their ground, not as heroes in a grand tale, but as ordinary people holding on to the last threads of a vanishing world. Their courage was not loud. It was the quiet courage of those who continue to fight even when the outcome is already written. And beneath this fragile unity lay deeper fractures, divisions that would return, even at the city's final hour. Long before Ottoman cannons threatened its walls, Constantinople had been weakened by a quieter struggle, one that unfolded not on battlements, but in hearts and sanctuaries. For centuries, the city lived between two worlds: the Orthodox tradition that shaped its identity and the Latin Catholic powers whose influence hovered uneasily over its politics. Old wounds ran deep, carved by mistrust, pride, and memories of betrayal that never fully faded. The Fourth Crusade, still vivid in collective memory, had left scars that time refused to mend. Even as invaders gathered beyond the horizon, that bitterness lingered like a shadow. When the empire's situation grew desperate, its leaders made a decision meant to summon help from the West, a temporary church union with Rome. The hope was simple: reconciliation might bring soldiers, ships, or gold. But the emotional cost proved heavier than expected. Many citizens felt the union was not a bridge, but a surrender of spiritual essence. To them, it seemed as though their deepest beliefs were being traded for assistance that never truly arrived. Inside churches, priests argued softly over rituals and doctrines. On the streets, whispers spread like thin smoke, carrying frustration and sorrow. Some viewed the union as betrayal, others saw it as the only pragmatic step left. Families found themselves divided at their own tables. Unity and faith, something that should have offered strength, became another point of fracture in a city already stretched thin. Despite the looming threat, these tensions remained unresolved. At night, as defenders patrolled the walls, the city below pulsed with quiet unease. The people prayed in the same language, under the same domes, yet their thoughts were separated by centuries of mistrust. It wasn't anger that filled the city, but a weary sadness, the kind that comes when a community realizes it cannot fully stand together, even in its hour of greatest need. This division did not break Constantinople by itself, but it hollowed the center, leaving fewer hands to carry the weight of what was coming. It sapped the energy needed for hope, leaving behind a fragile unity that strained each day beneath the sound of distant drums. And so, even as the city's defenders prepared to face the greatest army of their age, they did so knowing something vital had already been lost. For when the final hour approached, Constantinople would discover just how alone it truly stood. As the shadows of the Ottoman advance lengthened, Constantinople reached outward with the last strength it had left. Envoys were sent across Europe, carrying letters stamped with imperial seals that once commanded respect. They travelled roads worn by centuries of diplomacy, seeking aid from kingdoms that had long claimed friendship with Byzantium. In Italy, they pleaded with maritime republics whose ships had once filled the Golden Horn. In Hungary, they spoke of shared borders and shared dangers. In Rome, they appealed to the spiritual authority of the papacy, hoping faith alone might stir the West into action. But Europe had grown restless, divided, and consumed by its own storms. Italian city-states bickered among themselves, more interested in trade rivalries than distant threats. Hungary faced its own internal turmoil. Even the papacy, though sympathetic in words, hesitated, caught between theological tension and political hesitation. Promises were offered in soft tones. Help might come, fleets might be raised, armies might march. Yet those words drifted like smoke, never taking solid form. Each envoy returned with the same quiet expression, one that told the truth without needing to say it aloud. The world had moved on. The empire that once shaped continents had become a distant story, admired but no longer feared. Constantinople's pleas were heard with pity, not urgency. As news of these failed missions spread, the city felt its isolation deepen. Citizens gathered around docks, hoping to see Allied sails appear on the horizon, only to watch the sea remain empty. Priests led prayers for deliverance, their voices echoing faintly through half-filled churches. Even the emperor, steady as he was, felt the hollow realization settle within him. They were standing at the edge of a precipice, with no hand reaching out from beyond. The heartbreak was not dramatic. It was quiet, felt in the way workers paused during repairs to glance toward the open water, in the way merchants locked their shutters a little earlier each night, in the way soldiers tightened their grips on weapons they knew were too few. Isolation did not descend suddenly. It wrapped itself around the city inch by inch, a soft but suffocating veil. Constantinople had faced enemies for centuries, but never had it faced them so utterly alone. Now, With no allies to call upon, and no lifeline left to grasp, the stage was set for the Ottoman preparations that would seal its fate. At first, the approach of the Ottoman army felt distant, like a rumour carried on the wind. Scouts spoke of movement beyond the hills, of dust rising in long, drifting veils, of banners glinting faintly under the morning sun. But Constantinople had heard such reports before. Armies had come and gone. Threats had risen and faded. The city had grown used to waiting for danger, then watching it dissolve at the edge of the horizon. This time was different. Day by day, the horizon darkened. Lines of soldiers appeared where only empty fields had been. The hum of distant activity grew louder, more coordinated, more certain. Camps spread outward like ink across parchment, filling every open space between the land walls and the sea. At night, thousands of campfires flickered beyond the ramparts, casting a warm, unsettling glow that made the darkness feel alive. From the towers, defenders watched the lights multiply, each flame a silent reminder that an empire had come to claim the city's final breath. Citizens climbed to higher terraces, straining their eyes to see the pattern forming around them. Endless rows of tents stretched into the distance, white, red, and darkened by the shadows of evening. The Ottoman forces did not rush. They arrived in a calm, deliberate wave, arranging their lines with the patience of craftsmen, laying the foundation for an unbreakable structure. The stillness of their preparation made it clear. They did not merely intend to attack. They intended to surround, suffocate, and wait for the city to understand there was no path left open. As the ring tightened, the mood within the walls began to shift. Soldiers who had once spoken boldly now stood in thoughtful silence along the battlements. Merchants paused in their doorways longer than necessary, listening to the distant rhythm of marching boots. Even the gulls circling above the Golden Horn seemed to sense the tension, their cries sharper, more restless. The impending siege hung over the city like a gathering storm cloud, dark, heavy, and inevitable. And when the last gap in the encirclement closed, Constantinople felt it like a held breath finally released. There was no escape, no hidden route, no hope of outside intervention. Only the ancient walls remained between the city and the empire, waiting just beyond their stones. With the ring complete, a new sound rose over the plains, one that would shatter the illusion of safety the city had carried for 1,000 years. For a brief moment after the Ottomans completed their encirclement, the city existed in a strange, suspended quiet. The defenders stood along the battlements, watching the distant activity with a mixture of dread and disbelief. The morning air was cool, still, almost gentle, as if the world itself hesitated before taking its next breath. Then, somewhere beyond the lines of tents, a spark ignited, a fuse hissed, and time split open. The first cannon blast tore through the silence with a force that seemed to come from the earth itself. A deep, rolling thunder surged across the plain, shaking dust from ancient stones and rattling windows throughout the city. Birds scattered from the ramparts, children froze in the streets. Even seasoned soldiers, hardened by years of service, felt the shock ripple through their bodies. It was not just loud, it was final, a sound that carried the weight of something irreversible. The great walls, which had stood untested by such power for over a millennium, groaned under the impact. Stone cracked in sharp, startling lines. Pebbles rained from the battlements. A section of outer masonry quivered as though waking from a long sleep. Defenders who had believed the walls could withstand anything now stared in stunned silence, watching the unthinkable occur before their eyes. A weapon had arrived that did not respect the legends carved into those stones. Citizens felt the blast through the ground beneath their feet. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Doors opened slowly as people stepped out to listen, trying to understand what the sound meant. The city had heard countless threats through its long life, but this noise was different. It did not echo like the clash of armies or the roar of fires. It was a mechanical certainty, a reminder that time had forged a new kind of enemy. Another blast followed, then another, each one shaking the city a little more deeply. Dust drifted in quiet clouds as defenders tightened their grips on the ramparts. They were no longer guardians of an immortal fortress. They were witnesses to a myth beginning to fracture. The sound carried a message no one could ignore. The age of unbreachable walls had ended. And as the echoes faded into a trembling stillness, the cannons prepared to speak again, this time with a rhythm that would fill 40 relentless days. After the first blast, the cannons did not pause. Day after day, the earth trembled beneath Constantinople as the Ottoman artillery settled into a relentless rhythm. Morning light would barely touch the domes before the first deep boom rolled across the city, shaking dust from rafters and stirring the air with a heaviness that never quite lifted. The defenders learned to live with the sound, though live gradually became a softer word than it once had been. Each sunrise brought the same ritual. Soldiers climbed the walls to inspect new cracks, running their hands over fresh fractures that spidered across the ancient stone. Teams hurried to patch the damage with earth, timber, and whatever rubble they could gather. They worked with quiet urgency, knowing another blast could undo their efforts in seconds. Sweat mingled with dust on their skin. Exhaustion clung to them like a second cloak. Yet every day, they returned to the same positions, as though their presence alone might hold the walls together. Inside the city, life moved in muted patterns. Families slept lightly, waking at each thunderous strike. Priests lit candles in the Hagia Sophia, their voices rising in steady, mournful chants that mingled with the echo of artillery outside. Children clung to their parents, feeling the ground shiver beneath their feet with every impact. Merchants ventured briefly into the streets, but conversations were hushed, eyes constantly drifting toward the trembling walls. It felt as though the entire city had fallen into a trance caught between endurance and resignation. Nights brought no relief. The distant glow of Ottoman campfires burned steadily, and the cannons often roared well past dusk. Some blasts were spaced apart, others came in clusters, creating an erratic rhythm that kept the city in a state of constant alertness. Sleep became shallow, fragmented, easily broken by the next jolt of the earth. Even the defenders, hardened by duty, found their strength thinning as days blurred into one another. 40 days of thunder wore on the city like slow-moving tides, chipping away at walls, hope, and the belief that the fortress might hold. What had once been a symbol of eternal endurance now groaned beneath the pressure of a new age. And just as the defenders began to understand the full weight of the siege, something unexpected happened not from the land, but from the water. For weeks, Constantinople had trusted one part of its defense without question, the great chain that sealed the mouth of the Golden Horn. It had held firm through centuries of danger, stretching across the water like a silent guardian that no enemy fleet had ever breached. Behind it, the inner harbour remained calm, sheltered, and comfortably out of the Ottomans' reach. The defenders believed, with a rare sense of certainty, that at least the sea would not betray them. Then came the morning when everything changed. At dawn, a strange murmur rose from the northern walls, soldiers calling to one another with a sharpness that did not match the usual rhythm of the siege. Men climbed the towers, squinting into the pale light, unsure of what they were seeing. And then the impossible revealed itself. Ottoman ships gliding across the hills, their hulls sliding over greased logs, pulled by teams of oxen and soldiers. Masts swayed gently above the treetops. Oars rested neatly along the sides. The vessels moved not through water, but over land. The defenders stared in stunned silence. For a moment, no one spoke. It was as if the laws of the world had bent overnight. A fleet now stood behind the chain, not through force, but through imagination. Word raced through the city, spreading disbelief from battlement to marketplace. Citizens rushed to the walls, whispering prayers or curses as they watched the strange procession continue. The Ottomans worked with calm precision, guiding ship after ship down the slope toward the Golden Horn. What had seemed an unassailable barrier had been undone by sheer audacity. The psychological blow was immediate. If Mehmed could move ships across land, what else might he be capable of? The defenders realized they were not facing a conventional foe bound by traditional tactics. They were facing a ruler who viewed obstacles as invitations, who treated the natural world as something that could be rearranged if necessary. The siege was no longer just a contest of strength. It was a test of imagination, and the Ottomans were proving they possessed more of it. As the first ships touched the water behind the city's defences, a new tension settled over Constantinople. The walls still stood, the chain still held, but the sense of certainty had cracked. And now, with pressure rising from every side, the story shifts inward to the hearts and minds of the defenders holding the city together. When darkness settled over Constantinople during the siege, it carried a different weight than the nights before. The city, once filled with the familiar hum of evening life, felt suspended between fear and hope. Each sunset became a quiet reckoning. The defenders climbed down from the battered walls, dust clinging to their clothes, ears still ringing from cannon fire. Families opened their doors to them with tired smiles, offering water, bread, or simply a place to sit in silence. But beneath those gestures lay a deeper truth. Everyone sensed how fragile tomorrow had become. Inside the churches, candles multiplied like stars. Their small flames flickered against cracked mosaics, shimmering across faces lined with exhaustion. People gathered in clusters, mothers holding their children close, elders leaning on worn canes, soldiers kneeling with heads bowed. Prayers rose in soft waves, whispered rather than spoken, as if loud voices might somehow draw misfortune closer. Some prayed for victory, though few truly believed it. Others asked for strength, for mercy, or simply for one more day. The air was thick with incense and quiet trembling, each breath a plea for something beyond human power. Outside, the city was wrapped in an uneasy stillness. Streets that once echoed with laughter now carried only the faint murmur of footsteps as neighbors visited one another in search of comfort. On balconies overlooking the Golden Horn, families kept lanterns burning, hoping the small glow might steady their nerves. They watched the Ottoman campfires shimmering in the distance, a constellation of flames that seemed to draw closer each night. Even the youngest children sensed the change. Their games had quieted, replaced by questions whispered into their parents' clothing. Will the walls hold? Will we be safe? No one offered certain answers. Yet in these dimly lit hours, the city's spirit revealed itself. Faith did not erase fear, but it created a space where people could gather their courage. Doubt lingered, but so did devotion. Soldiers returned to their posts at dawn, carrying the residue of those prayers within them, as though the candle's glow had woven itself into their resolve. Still, beneath the comfort, an unspoken truth remained. Fear had seeped into every corner of the city, binding itself to hope in a tense and delicate balance. And from this fragile mixture, the defenders would have to find a way to keep morale alive in the days that followed. As the siege deepened and the nights grew heavier, Constantine XI understood that the greatest battle was not always fought on the walls, but within the hearts of those who defended them. Each morning, before the cannons opened their relentless chorus, he walked the ramparts with his commanders. His armor was simple, worn smooth at the edges, but his presence steadied the soldiers more than any polished regalia could. He greeted them one by one, offering brief words that carried the weight of genuine concern. In his voice, they heard not an emperor issuing orders, but a man sharing their burden. Sometimes he paused at places where the walls had cracked the day before, resting his hand on the patched stone as if reassuring the city itself. Soldiers gathered around him, listening to short, measured speeches, never dramatic, never filled with false promises. He did not speak of guaranteed salvation or miraculous rescue. Instead, he spoke of duty, of honor, of the shared history beneath their feet. His honesty became its own form of hope, quiet but durable. Commanders followed his example. They moved among the ranks, noticing fatigue before it became despair, placing a hand on a shoulder, exchanging a few soft words, reminding each soldier that they were not standing alone. In the inner courtyards, they visited the wounded, offering the comfort of presence even when medicine could do little. Their leadership resembled a slow-burning lantern rather than a blazing torch, steady, consistent, refusing to go out. The city's people played their part as well. Women carried baskets of bread to the ramparts, handing them to soldiers with weary smiles. Elderly men swept debris from courtyards to keep pathways clear. Children brought water to the workers repairing the walls, their small hands trembling under the weight of the buckets. Every gesture, however small, became a thread woven into a larger tapestry of endurance. And yet, beneath this carefully tended hope, everyone sensed the edges beginning to fray. Each day, the walls looked more battered. Each night, the cannon fire seemed to come a little closer, a little stronger. Even the emperor felt the quiet truth settling in his bones. Time was slipping through their fingers. Still, he returned to the walls each day, because hope, even fragile hope, had to be tended like a flame exposed to the wind. Soon, however, the cracks in the stone and in the defenders themselves would become impossible to ignore. The walls of Constantinople had endured for 1,000 years, but under 40 days of cannon fire, even legend began to crumble. At dawn, when the defenders climbed the ramparts, they saw new fractures spreading like dark veins across the ancient stones. Some cracks were thin as threads, others large enough to slip a hand through. The damage grew not in sudden bursts, but in slow, steady breaths, as if the walls themselves were tired of standing. With each blast, dust rose in pale clouds, drifting over the battlements like a quiet reminder that nothing, not even stone, is immune to time. Repair crews worked without pause. Men carried baskets of rubble on trembling arms. Others jammed wooden beams into widening crevices or stacked earth in desperate layers where the walls sagged. Hammering echoed through the day and deep into the night, the rhythm frantic, uneven, edged with urgency. Sometimes repairs collapsed before they were finished, sending stones tumbling in showers that forced workers to leap aside with startled shouts. Yet no one walked away. They returned to the broken places again and again, driven by something deeper than duty, the knowledge that every minute gained was precious. The defenders felt the same strain settling into their bodies. Sleep had become a memory. Eyes twitched from fatigue, hands shook even when empty, and armor felt heavier with each passing hour. Conversations grew shorter, not out of anger, but because breath itself had become a resource to conserve. Some soldiers stood on the ramparts swaying slightly, held upright by will alone. Others leaned against the battlements with closed eyes, gathering strength before the next wave of cannon fire. Inside the city, the emotional cracks spread just as quietly. Families waited in dim rooms, listening to the walls tremble under distant impacts. Merchants who once spoke with confidence now whispered to one another, glancing toward the harbour with hollow hope. Even the priests felt weariness seeping into their prayers. The city was still standing, but the shared belief that it could endure forever had begun to thin. Still, no one surrendered to despair. There was a stubbornness in the people, a refusal to yield even as the edges of their world frayed. They held fast, though they could feel the slow unravelling beneath their feet. Soon, however, the strain of these unending days would reach its breaking point, and the night before the final assault would bring a silence unlike any they had ever known. On the final night before the assault, Constantinople felt suspended between two worlds. The city lay under a moon so pale it seemed almost hesitant to shine, as though light itself feared disturbing what was coming. Along the walls, soldiers stood in long, unbroken lines, their silhouettes softened by the glow of distant campfires. No one spoke unless necessary. Even whispers felt too loud, as if words could ripple through the air and hasten the dawn they all dreaded. The cannons were silent for the first time in many days. Their absence created a strange hollowness, a quiet so deep it disturbed the senses. Soldiers found themselves listening for the thunder that never came, their bodies instinctively bracing for impacts that did not arrive. Above them, banners hung limp in the stillness, untouched by wind. It was the kind of silence that presses against the ribs, heavy, watchful, aware. Inside the city, people gathered in the Hagia Sophia. Candles filled the vast cathedral with trembling halos of gold, reflecting off mosaics that had witnessed centuries of triumph and sorrow. Families huddled together, some kneeling, others sitting with clasped hands, their eyes fixed on the shimmering dome above. Voices rose in waves of prayer, soft and steady, flowing through the sacred space like a tide. Many had prayed before, but tonight felt different. Tonight the prayers carried weight, urgency, and the quiet acceptance that tomorrow might reshape the world they knew. In the streets, the usual footfalls of night had disappeared. Doors were barred gently. Windows remained open just enough for lantern light to spill into the alleys. A few citizens wandered slowly, taking in familiar sights with the tenderness of farewell. An old fountain, a market stall, a worn stone archway. They moved not with panic, but with the fragile reverence of people aware they were living the final pages of a long story. The emperor spent part of the night walking the battlements, pausing to rest his hand on the weathered stone, as if offering silent gratitude. His presence alone steadied those who watched him pass. No grand speech was required. His quiet steps said everything. When the sky finally darkened into its deepest shade, the city seemed to exhale. Destiny hovered over it like a shadow waiting to descend. And when dawn returned, it would bring the storm that would end 1,000 years in a single day. In the final hour before dawn, Constantinople entered a silence so deep it felt almost unreal. The night held its breath, and the city followed. Along the walls, Defenders stood motionless beneath a sky drained of colour, their faces lit only by the faint glow of torches guttering in the windless dark. They knew the assault was coming. Every instinct told them the next light they saw would not be the sun, but fire. Yet they waited with the quiet endurance of people who had long run out of choices. Far beyond the ramparts, faint sounds drifted through the stillness. Ottoman drums beating in slow, steady pulses, like a distant heartbeat growing stronger with each passing moment. The rhythm carried through the air, unsettling in its calm certainty. Occasionally, a single shout rose in the enemy camp, sharp and fleeting, then vanished again into the night. Torches appeared on the horizon in shifting patterns, weaving along the ridgeline like restless stars. The defenders watched them without speaking, their eyes fixed on the movements they could barely interpret. The cold bit deeper than usual. Soldiers pulled their cloaks tighter, their breath rising in pale clouds. Some gripped their weapons with hands that trembled not from fear alone, but from exhaustion carved into bone. Others closed their eyes briefly, offering small, silent prayers, asking for strength, forgiveness, or simply the courage to stand a few moments longer. The weight of the impending dawn pressed against every mind. No one imagined rescue, no one imagined escape. Nothing remained but the walls beneath their feet and the comrades beside them. Inside the city, a few lanterns glowed in upper windows as families remained awake, listening to the distant drums. Mothers held their children close, hoping their embrace might shield them from what approached. Elderly men and women sat by doorways, staring into the dark as if trying to memorize the shape of their world before it changed forever. The entire city felt wrapped in a thin, trembling veil, the fragile quiet before history breaks open. As the first faint hint of pale blue touched the eastern sky, the drums grew louder. Torches gathered in dense clusters. Movement rippled through the Ottoman lines, unmistakable and immense. The hour before dawn had ended. The storm it foretold had finally arrived. And with the first surge of sound and motion, the final assault began. The first light of dawn had barely touched the horizon when the Ottoman lines erupted into motion. A wave of sound rose from the darkness, drums thundering in rapid succession, horns blaring in deep, rolling calls that vibrated against the ancient stones. The defenders straightened instantly, every muscle tightening as the long-expected moment finally arrived. What had been distant anticipation only minutes before now surged forward with undeniable force. From the ramparts, the soldiers watched shapes emerge from the dim morning haze. Ranks of infantry advanced in disciplined lines, shields raised, spears pointed toward the sky. Behind them, the silhouettes of siege towers and ladders moved with unsettling purpose. Torches flickered across the plains, casting brief flashes of orange over faces determined and unyielding. It was a sea of motion, an entire army pushing forward with the calm certainty of an incoming tide. The cannons roared next. Their blasts shattered the thin veil of dawnlight, shaking dust from the cracked walls and rattling through the defenders' chests. Each impact struck with a low, rolling force that blended with the rising shouts of men below. Arrows hissed upward in dark clusters. Stones tumbled from damaged battlements. The city had endured weeks of bombardment, yet the violence of this morning felt different, more focused, more overwhelming, as though the entire weight of the empire had narrowed into this single hour. Defenders scrambled along the ramparts, reinforcing weak points, dragging planks into place, calling directions through the rising noise. Their movements were frantic, but practiced. Many had been here since the first days of the siege. Their bodies knew the rhythm even when their minds faltered. The clash of metal echoed across the walls as the first Ottoman soldiers reached the base, raising ladders against the battered parapets. The defenders leaned over the edge, pushing them back with poles and stones, breath coming fast and uneven. Yet even in the chaos, a strange calm lingered. The sounds, cannons, horns, shouts, splintering wood blended into a heavy, hypnotic cadence, as though the battle itself were breathing. The defenders felt it in their bones. This was not merely an attack. It was the collapse of an age pressing forward with unstoppable momentum. The city groaned under the strain. The walls shuddered. Dust clouds drifted like ghosts through the morning air. And amid the turmoil, a moment approached subtle at first, then unmistakable when the assault shifted from pressure to breakthrough. The critical breach was coming, and with it, the unraveling of a millennium. For hours, the defenders had pushed back, wave after wave, holding the shattered walls through sheer will. But the ancient stones, battered by weeks of bombardment and the relentless pressure of the assault, had reached their limit. Near the gate of Street Romanus, where cracks had deepened day by day, the wall trembled beneath another thunderous cannon blast. Dust rose in thick clouds, drifting through the morning air like a warning the wind could not carry fast enough. Then it happened, a deep, resonant fracture, followed by the groan of stone giving way. The weakened section shuddered, once, twice, and collapsed in a sudden roar, sending fragments cascading into the moat and knocking defenders from their positions. The sound rolled across the city, like the breaking of something far older than masonry. It was not merely a wall that had fallen. It was the last barrier of a 1,000-year empire. For a moment, there was silence, a stunned pause, as both sides recognized what had just occurred. Then the Ottomans surged forward. Janissaries rushed into the gap with disciplined precision, shields raised, voices rising in fierce cries that echoed through the breach. More followed behind them, pouring into the opening like a river finally breaking through a dam. The defenders who remained tried desperately to form a line, stepping over rubble, pulling injured comrades to their feet, using swords and spears with exhausted hands. They fought not to win, but to buy seconds, precious, fleeting seconds. Inside the city, the tremor was felt like a shockwave. Citizens looked toward the walls with hollow eyes, feeling the shift before they fully understood it. The unthinkable had become real. The walls that had protected their ancestors for centuries had finally surrendered to time. Yet, the tone within Constantinople was not chaotic. It was heavy, slow, inevitable. History did not crash down all at once. It settled, quietly, like dust finding its place after a long fall. The defenders knew the breach could not be sealed. The Ottomans knew the end had begun, and the city itself seemed to hold its breath, aware that the moment dividing its long past from its uncertain future had arrived. Through the rising dust, amid the shouts and collapsing stone, one truth became clear. Constantinople had entered its final hour. And now, as the breach widened, all eyes would turn to the emperor who faced his last decision on the battlefield he refused to abandon. As the breach widened and the defenders fell back in scattered lines, Constantine XI understood that the empire's final moment had arrived. He did not retreat into the palace, nor seek sanctuary in hidden chambers. Instead, he paused on the broken ramparts and looked out over the city he had sworn to protect. The morning light was pale, drifting gently over rooftops and shattered stone. From this vantage, Constantinople appeared almost peaceful, its domes glowing softly, its streets still silent. It was a farewell glimpse, taken not with despair, but with quiet acceptance. Turning from the view, he removed the purple cloak that marked him as emperor, letting it fall to the ground. Without it, he was simply another soldier among the defenders, another pair of hands, another heart beating in the storm. Those near him watched in silence, recognizing the significance of the gesture. There would be no negotiations, no last-minute escape, no surviving lineage to continue the imperial line. Constantine chose to meet the end where he had lived, beside his people. He moved toward the front of the final defensive line, stepping over rubble and fallen comrades. His sword felt heavier than it once had, but his resolve did not waver. Around him, soldiers straightened their backs, drawing strength from the calm in his eyes. He did not address them with speeches. He offered only a brief, steady nod, as if to say that everything left to be spoken had already been shared in the long days behind them. When the Janissaries surged through the breach again, their cries rising with renewed force, Constantine stepped forward to meet them. Steel clashed in violent bursts, but the chaos around him seemed muted, softened by the enormity of what was ending. He fought with the same determination he had carried throughout the siege, not for victory, but for honor. Each movement, each breath, each step was a testament to the empire he embodied. No chronicler recorded his final words with certainty. Some said he prayed. Others believed he whispered an apology to the city. But most agreed on one thing. He met the end standing upright, facing the enemy with unbroken dignity. When he fell, a chapter older than kingdoms and older than memory closed with him. And with the emperor gone, the city itself began its final transformation. The quiet, inevitable fall of a world that had endured 1,000 years. When the last pockets of resistance collapsed, Constantinople entered a silence, unlike anything it had ever known. The city, which had echoed with prayers, shouts, and cannon fire for weeks, suddenly felt emptied of sound, as though the air itself had paused in shock. Along the broken ramparts, defenders who had fought until their strength dissolved now lay still, their final efforts fading into the morning light. The Ottoman banners rose over the shattered walls, fluttering softly in the breeze, a quiet signal that the ancient fortress had finally surrendered. In the streets below, footsteps scattered in every direction. Some citizens fled instinctively, racing through familiar alleys with no clear destination, driven only by the need to move. Others froze where they stood, overcome not by terror, but by disbelief. The fall of the city had been a fear whispered for generations. Yet when it arrived, it felt unreal, too heavy, too sudden, too vast to comprehend. Doors slammed shut, windows were barred. Families huddled together in dim rooms, listening for sounds beyond their walls. Distant shouts, hurried commands, the echo of boots on stone. But beneath these noises lay a deeper stillness, a strange calm that seeped into the city like fog. It was the silence that follows something irreversible, the moment when the world realizes it has turned a page it can never return from. The Hagia Sophia, once filled with night-long prayers, now stood frozen in the soft glow of its candles. Clergy and citizens gathered inside felt the shift long before the doors opened. They knew the empire that had carried their ancestors' stories for 1,000 years had, in a single morning, become part of history. Some wept softly, not out of panic, but out of an aching sorrow, an awareness that they were living through the end of something immense. Outside, the Ottomans advanced with steady control, securing the streets and guiding the city into a new order. Their presence spread through the neighborhoods like a tide, quiet but undeniable. The defenders were gone. The emperor had fallen. The walls had finally bowed to time. And in that strange, trembling stillness, Constantinople stood suspended, caught between the world it had been and the world it would now become. Soon, the man who had reshaped its fate would enter the city not as a destroyer, but as a ruler stepping into the heart of his new empire. When Mehmed II entered Constantinople, he did so not with the frenzy of a victorious general, but with the deliberate pace of someone approaching a moment he had imagined all his life. The dust of battle still hung over the city, drifting in pale veils through the morning air. Smoke rose from scattered fires, mingling with the scent of broken stone. Yet the conqueror moved through it quietly, as though aware that he was stepping into the final breath of a world that had endured 1,000 years. Ottoman soldiers flanked him, maintaining order as he advanced along streets that had once echoed with Byzantine pride. Citizens watched from shuttered windows, uncertain whether to fear him or simply observe the beginning of a new chapter they did not choose. Mehmed did not shout commands or raise his sword in triumph. Instead, he studied the city with somber eyes, absorbing the enormity of what had unfolded. He had taken the city emperors had failed to capture for centuries, but standing inside its broken heart, he seemed to understand that victory and loss often share the same silence. His first orders were unexpected. He commanded his soldiers to protect civilians, to stop looting, to preserve as much of the city as possible. He spoke not as a man eager to punish, but as a ruler determined to shape what he had gained. The empire he envisioned needed a living capital, not a graveyard. Then he walked toward the Hagia Sophia. The grand cathedral, once the spiritual center of the Byzantine world, now stood heavy with quiet, its doors closed, candles still burning faintly within. Mehmed dismounted and approached it alone. Some accounts say he paused before stepping inside, as if acknowledging the weight of centuries behind those walls. When he entered, he found citizens and clergy gathered in fearful stillness. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked around the vast interior, the golden mosaics, the towering dome, and whispered a prayer of gratitude for the destiny that had brought him here. In that moment, the city shifted. It was no longer the last holdout of an ancient empire. It was the first stone of a new one. Now, the transformation of Constantinople would begin, its identity rewritten, its future reshaped under new rule. When Mehmed stepped into the Hagia Sophia, the vast cathedral held its breath. Dust floated lazily in the shafts of morning light, drifting through the immense dome like pale, wandering spirits. The echoes of the city's fall had not yet faded from the air. Yet inside this space, time seemed to move differently, slower, quieter, as though aware of the weight of what was about to unfold. For nearly 1,000 years, this building had been the heart of the Byzantine soul. Every coronation, every prayer, every sorrow and celebration had rippled through these stones. Now, its identity rested on the edge of change. Ottoman soldiers entered behind their sultan with respectful silence. Their footsteps softened on the ancient marble, their eyes rising instinctively toward the golden mosaics shimmering through the dim haze. Some of those mosaics had survived earthquakes, fires, and centuries of history. Now they witnessed another transformation, one not born of destruction, but of transition. Mehmed moved slowly down the central nave, taking in the grandeur that had captivated generations. This was not a building to be conquered, it was a treasure to be preserved. When he reached the front of the vast hall, he knelt and pressed his forehead to the ground, offering the first prayer of a new era. The words rose softly, carried gently across the domed chamber, a language unfamiliar to the walls, yet spoken with reverence. It was in this moment that Hagia Sophia began its transformation from cathedral to mosque, from the spiritual center of one empire to the sacred heart of another. Workers unfurled carpets across the marble floor. Priests and citizens, watching from a distance, felt an ache of loss settle inside them, but also a strange sense of continuity. The building was not being erased. It was being reinterpreted, its purpose shifting but its presence enduring. Sunlight shifted as the morning advanced, illuminating different corners of the space. The high galleries, the ancient columns, the mosaics that would soon be veiled but not forgotten. Every glimmer seemed to acknowledge that this was not an ending alone, but a beginning woven with memory. Outside, word spread through the streets that the great cathedral had changed its voice. The city felt the shift like a soft tremor, the final confirmation that Byzantium had passed into history and something new had taken its place. And now, with Hagia Sophia transformed, the rebirth of the entire city under its new ruler was about to begin. In the days following the conquest, Constantinople began to exhale slowly, cautiously, as though awakening from a long and painful sleep. The city had fallen, yet it was not left to decay. Mehmed II saw more than ruins and emptied streets. He saw the outline of a future capital, a place that could anchor a rising empire. Under the faint curve of the crescent moon, he began a transformation that would reshape the city's destiny. His first priority was life itself. He ordered the return of those who had fled and sent for artisans, merchants, and families from across his realm to repopulate the quiet neighborhoods. Caravans arrived with people from Anatolia, the Balkans, and distant provinces, carrying with them languages, customs, and energy the city had not felt in generations. Slowly, abandoned homes found new voices. Markets reopened with cautious optimism. The empty streets that once echoed with fear began to fill with footsteps again. Mehmed moved with deliberate purpose. He repaired the walls, restored fountains and aqueducts, and revived the grand markets that had once made the city a crossroads of the world. His vision was not merely practical, it was cultural. He welcomed Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities, granting them space to rebuild their own spiritual lives. Constantinople, now Istanbul, ceased to be the exclusive relic of a fallen empire and became a mosaic of many peoples, woven together under a new banner. In this rebirth, the city took on a different rhythm. The call to prayer mingled with the tolling of distant church bells. New schools were founded. Artisans set up workshops. Ships returned to the Golden Horn, their sails catching the wind with a sense of renewed purpose. The transformation did not erase the past. It layered new chapters atop ancient foundations. To walk through the streets during these early days was to feel the city shifting beneath one's feet, grief slowly, giving way to reshaping, ruin softening into renewal. The crescent moon above seemed to cradle the city gently, as though marking both an ending and a beginning. Mehmed's vision ensured that Constantinople would not vanish into legend. Instead, it evolved, becoming a city that belonged not to a single people, but to the world. And now, with the city reborn, the story expands outward toward the world that would forever change because of its fall. When news of Constantinople's fall reached Europe, it arrived not as a distant report, but as a tremor that ran through every royal court and cathedral. Messengers carried the story across mountains and through cities, still wrapped in spring, quiet, and with each retelling, the same stunned silence followed. The greatest Christian stronghold in the East, the city that had stood like a guardian between continents, was gone. For many, it felt as though the world had shifted overnight. Kings and nobles listened in disbelief. Advisors spoke in hurried tones, struggling to outline the implications. The Ottomans, once perceived as a distant force pressing at the edges of Christendom, had now proven themselves capable of conquering the unconquerable. A city that had resisted for 1,000 years had fallen in a single morning. The psychological impact was immediate. If Constantinople could not survive, what hope did smaller kingdoms have against the expanding empire to the east? Merchants felt the change just as sharply. The fall disrupted old trading routes that linked Europe to the riches of Asia. Markets tensed, uncertain whether the familiar flow of goods would continue or reshape itself under new powers. It was not only fear that spread, but also a deep sense of vulnerability, a recognition that Europe's position in the world was no longer guaranteed. Church leaders responded with sorrow and solemn calls for unity, though many understood privately that unity had come far too late. The loss of the city symbolized more than military defeat. It represented the end of a spiritual frontier. For centuries, Constantinople had been the eastern anchor of Christian civilization. With it gone, Europe felt exposed, as if the map of the world had been redrawn without anyone's permission. Yet beneath the grief and anxiety, something else stirred, an awareness that change, vast and unstoppable, was unfolding. The fall reminded Europe that its old assumptions could no longer hold. It prompted questions about strategy, identity, and the future of trade. And in the minds of a few, the shock carried a different kind of spark. If the traditional pathways to the east were threatened, perhaps new ones had to be found. Across the continent, a continent awakened not only to fear, but to possibility. Next, we explore how this awakening led to a new age of exploration that would reshape the entire world. In the months after Constantinople fell, Europe began to understand a truth that was not immediately obvious. The event had not only ended a millennium-old empire, it had rearranged the geography of possibility. With the Ottomans now controlling the heart of the old trade routes, access to the east became uncertain, taxed, or entirely blocked. Spices, silk, and precious goods that had once flowed steadily through Byzantine lands now moved under new authority. European kingdoms, long accustomed to the familiar pathways across the Mediterranean, found themselves staring at a world that had quietly closed one door and left them searching for another. This shift did not happen with a single decision or proclamation. It emerged slowly, like ripples spreading from a stone dropped into a still river. Merchants complained of rising costs. Courts debated how to secure their economies. Sailors whispered about unexplored waters. In Portugal, navigators studied the winds curling along Africa's coast. In Spain, ambitious thinkers wondered if the world could be circled in the opposite direction. The fall of Constantinople, though tragic, became a catalyst, an invisible push that nudged Europe toward horizons it had never truly considered. The irony lay in the contrast. The city's collapse happened in one violent morning, a flash of history that shattered a 1,000-year story. But the consequences unfolded quietly, stretching across decades and then centuries. As the Ottomans fortified their new capital, European rulers funded expeditions that would carry their banners into unknown seas. Ships set sail with uncertain maps and fragile hopes, searching not for conquest, but for connection, alternate routes to the east that bypassed Ottoman control. These voyages, hesitant at first, grew bolder. One led to the coast of West Africa. Another pushed into the Atlantic. And another, guided by a mariner, convinced the world curved differently than most believed would cross an ocean no European had dared traverse before. A chain of events had begun, and its origins traced back not only to ambition, but to loss. Thus, the fall of Constantinople became one of the hidden foundations of the modern world. It redirected human movement, reshaped economies, and sparked an age defined by exploration, discovery, and transformation. The city's last night became the world's next dawn. Now, we turn our gaze eastward to see how the Ottoman victory reshaped their own empire and the centuries that followed. The capture of Constantinople did not simply expand the borders of the Ottoman Empire, it reshaped its destiny. With the city secured, The empire gained not only a strategic capital, but a cultural crossroads where ideas, peoples, and ambitions could converge. Under Mehmed II and his successors, this once broken city became the heart of a civilization entering its most luminous era. The victory that ended one world opened a gateway into another. Mehmed saw Istanbul not as a trophy, but as a canvas. He invited scholars, poets, architects, and artisans from across his vast territories to breathe new life into the city. Workshops filled with the sound of chisels and hammers. Schools were founded, libraries expanded, and scholars debated philosophy, astronomy, and mathematics under the domes of madrasas. The city's intellectual pulse, once dimmed by centuries of decline, beat again with renewed strength. Architecture became the empire's grand language. Inspired by Byzantine foundations yet guided by new vision, Ottoman architects began crafting the skyline that would define an era. Mosques rose with sweeping courtyards and soaring minarets. Palaces unfolded into intricate gardens and ornate halls. The fusion of influences Persian, Arab, Byzantine, and local traditions created a style that felt both ancient and newly born. Istanbul transformed from a wounded capital into a masterpiece of human design. Trade flourished. Positioned at the meeting point of continents, the city became a bustling center of commerce, where caravans, ships, and merchants exchanged goods and stories. Markets overflowed with spices, silk, ceramics, and precious metals. Wealth flowed into the empire, strengthening its courts, armies, and cultural institutions. With prosperity came confidence, a sense that the Ottoman world was not merely surviving but blossoming. Science and learning advanced as well. Astronomers charted the heavens with increasing precision. Physicians studied new methods of healing. Historians and poets chronicled the empire's achievements, weaving a narrative of growth that extended far beyond the battlefield. The Ottoman Golden Age was not defined solely by power, but by the depth and breadth of its creativity. The fall of Constantinople had been a moment of profound ending. Yet from its ruins rose a flourishing empire that shaped centuries of world history. Istanbul became both a memory and a beginning, a bridge between what had been and what could be. And now, with the rise complete, it is time to explore the legacy left behind, a millennium's worth of memory echoing through the ages. Even after its walls fell silent and its emperor vanished into legend, Byzantium did not disappear. It lingered like a soft echo carried across centuries, shaping thoughts, borders, and identities, long after the city that birthed it changed its name. Empires may collapse in a single morning, but their memories drift far beyond the moment of ruin. And Byzantium, with its rituals, mosaics, and thousand-year heartbeat, refused to fade quietly. In the Orthodox world, the memory of Constantinople became a lantern held through generations. Churches from Athens to Moscow whispered fragments of its old hymns. Icons painted in distant monasteries still echoed the gold of Hagia Sophia. Kings crowned themselves with titles hinting at inheritance, as if by invoking the city's lost grandeur, they might borrow its endurance. The idea of Byzantium survived not through land or armies, but through memory, a spiritual thread woven into the identity of millions. In Western Europe, the fall sparked a different kind of remembrance. Chroniclers wrote about the city with reverent sorrow, embellishing its final hours until it entered the realm of myth. Painters imagined the emperor's last stand with luminous strokes. Scholars debated its decline as if understanding it might help them avoid their own. Constantinople became both warning and wonder, a symbol of how even the greatest civilizations can vanish if time and pride move faster than adaptation. Its fall haunted the imagination of Europe, becoming a quiet mirror in which nations glimpsed their possible futures. And in modern Turkey, the memory took on yet another form, not a vanished world, but a foundation. The Ottomans absorbed Byzantine artistry, architecture, and administrative structure, blending them into something new and unmistakably their own. Istanbul today carries layers of both empires in its stones, minarets rising beside ancient columns, markets following the lines of forgotten forums, neighborhoods shaped by centuries of shifting cultures. The city itself is a living archive, where echoes of Byzantium still resonate beneath the call to prayer and the hum of modern life. History rarely ends where we think it does. Civilizations leave traces in languages, beliefs, buildings, and unspoken habits. Byzantium may have died as a political power, but as an idea, as a memory, it never truly left. And now, stepping beyond the timeline of battles and empires, we turn to the deeper lessons hidden in this long, winding story, lessons that speak to every age, including our own. For 1,000 years, Constantinople lived behind walls that seemed older than fear itself. Each victory it survived, each siege it endured, became another stone in an invisible monument to its own endurance. Over time, the city built more than defenses. It built a myth, the quiet, powerful belief that what had always been strong would remain strong forever. This illusion did not appear suddenly. It grew slowly, settling into the minds of emperors and citizens alike, soft as dust on ancient marble. Strength, when repeated across generations, begins to resemble destiny. People stop questioning it. They stop imagining alternatives, and they begin to trust the past more than the present. Byzantium fell into this pattern with gentle steps. The memory of previous triumphs became a shield against uncomfortable truths. When new threats rose, they were compared to old ones and dismissed. When the world changed, the city clung to what had once saved it, unaware that the old strategies no longer fit the new shape of danger. Civilizations often collapse this way, not through sudden weakness, but through the quiet weight of unexamined confidence. The Byzantines believed their walls were eternal. They believed their traditions would outlast every challenge. They believed time itself was on their side, and in that belief, they lost the ability to see how the world outside was transforming. But this illusion is not unique to empires. It lives in people too. We trust what has protected us before. We cling to familiar routines, familiar explanations, familiar comforts. Change feels distant until it stands at the door. Constantinople's tragedy was not simply military or political. It was psychological, a reminder that past success can become a blindfold if held too tightly. The walls did not fail because they were weak. They failed because the world around them had evolved faster than the city behind them. And the belief in eternal strength kept the Byzantines anchored to a world that no longer existed. In the quiet reflection of this truth lies a universal lesson. What endures must also adapt. Even stone must be reshaped if the landscape shifts. And so, as we move forward, the next section examines another force that shapes both nations and individuals, the danger of ignoring the changes we cannot yet see. Byzantium did not fall because it was weak. It fell because the world around it began to move at a pace it no longer recognized. For centuries, Constantinople had been the center of a familiar map, a place where trade flowed, alliances circled, and old enemies behaved in predictable patterns. But slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, the world shifted. New powers grew bolder. New technologies reshaped the battlefield. New economies rewrote the rules of influence. And the empire, bound to its own rhythms, struggled to keep up. Its decline was not dramatic. It unfolded like a slow-moving tide, retreating inch by inch without anyone noticing how far the waterline had fallen. Byzantium clung to old diplomatic habits long after they had lost their meaning. It negotiated as if its name alone carried the weight it once had. It sought allies in places where the political landscape had already changed. It leaned on traditions that had once been strengths but had quietly become limitations. Militarily, the world had entered a new age. Gunpowder, artillery, and evolving tactics transformed warfare into something unrecognizable. Yet the empire continued to trust its ancient walls, believing stone could outlast innovation. Economically, trade routes shifted westward, enriching kingdoms that once looked to Constantinople for direction. Diplomatically, Europe grew fragmented and inward-looking, no longer seeing the empire as central to its survival. Each of these shifts was subtle on its own, but together they formed a tide stronger than any single decision or battle. Civilizations rarely collapse in an instant. Their endings are usually written long before the final blow arrives. Byzantium's fall was not a moment, it was a culmination. By the time the Ottoman cannons arrived, the empire had already been outpaced by a changing world. The siege simply revealed what had taken generations to form. This story carries a gentle warning for anyone listening in the quiet of the night. When the world changes faster than you do, even strength can become fragile. Adaptation is not simply a strategy, it is a requirement for survival. What endures is not what stays the same, but what learns to evolve. And so, having explored the weight of change, the next section turns to another force that shapes the fate of civilizations, the leadership that can either guide transformation or stand helpless against it. Every empire rests, in its final and first moments, upon the shoulders of those chosen to lead it. In the story of Constantinople's fall, two figures stand at opposite horizons of history, Constantine XI and Mehmed II. One inherited a fading world, the other shaped an ascending one. Their lives intersected for only a brief moment, yet that moment carried the weight of centuries. Constantine XI ruled a kingdom already stretched thin, its strength worn down by time rather than conquest. His leadership was not marked by grand ambitions, but by the quiet bravery of endurance. He understood the limits of his power and the fragility of what remained, yet he chose to stand with his people rather than retreat into safety. His decisions were shaped less by strategy and more by responsibility, the deep, solemn kind that binds a person to a place even as it crumbles beneath them. In him, we see the dignity of a leader who carries decline with grace. Mehmed II, by contrast, led with the fire of a rising world. Young, visionary, and relentless, he approached leadership not as preservation, but as transformation. Where Constantine sought to defend an inheritance, Mehmed sought to create a legacy. His decisions were guided by ambition, intellect, and an unwavering belief in his own destiny. He studied the failures of others, reshaped the battlefield, and refused to accept limits that had constrained generations of commanders. In him, we see the momentum of a leader who channels the force of change. Neither man was shaped solely by personal will. Both were products of the worlds that raised them, one shaped by the long twilight of a weary empire, the other by the rising dawn of an expanding one. Their leadership reflects a universal truth. History does not simply choose its figures, it molds them. And yet, within that shaping, individuals still make choices that ripple far beyond their lifetimes. Constantine's final stand and Mehmed's determined advance reveal two sides of the same truth. Leadership is as much about carrying the emotional weight of a moment as it is about directing armies or shaping policies. It is the quiet burden of knowing that the fate of millions rests on decisions made in solitude. And now, as we near the end of this long arc, the final section looks beyond leaders and battles to ask a deeper question. Why does the fall of Constantinople still matter today? Some moments in history refuse to fade. They linger at the edges of modern life, shaping how nations see themselves and how people understand their place in the world. The fall of Constantinople is one of those moments not because it ended an empire, but because it rearranged the emotional and political map of entire civilizations. Even today, its echoes appear in borders, tensions, alliances, and stories whispered across centuries. For the Orthodox world, the fall remains a spiritual wound. It symbolizes the loss of a sacred center, a city that once defined identity and belief. Prayers, architecture, and liturgies still carry faint traces of a world that vanished in 1453. To many, the memory is not mere history, it is inheritance, a reminder of resilience, displacement, and the fragile nature of cultural continuity. In the Muslim world, especially in Turkey, the conquest stands as a symbol of triumph, transformation, and the birth of a new era. Modern Istanbul still carries the pride of that victory in its skyline and in the stories told from generation to generation. It marks a moment when a rising empire stepped into its golden age, reshaping the destiny of 3 continents. The memory fuels debates, inspires art, and influences national identity even now. In the West, the fall is something else entirely, a cautionary tale. It is the reminder that even the greatest powers can crumble if they fail to adapt. Politicians quote it. Historians revisit it. Strategists map its lessons onto modern conflicts. The fall of Constantinople taught Europe that no civilization is immune to change, and that the world can pivot suddenly beneath your feet. Even the map of today bears its imprint. Borders, trade routes, cultural divides, and geopolitical rivalries all trace back in some way to that night when the walls finally broke. The fall did not stay in the past. It traveled forward, carried by memory, myth, and meaning. This is why the story haunts the modern world. It is not just about stone walls and cannon fire. It is about the hidden forces that shape destiny, pride, adaptation, courage, and the fragile illusion that any society can stand unchanged forever. And now, with history's echoes surrounding us, we move to the final chapter, a calm meditation on endings, beginnings, and what remains after empires fade. Constantinople may have fallen in a single morning, but its presence never truly left the world. It lingers in places most people never think to look: in the rise of a dome, the curve of an archway, the rhythm of a prayer, or the quiet shimmer of mosaics hidden beneath later centuries. Cities can die in stone, yet survive in memory, carried forward by those who refuse to let their stories go. And few cities have ever lived so powerfully in the realm of remembrance as Constantinople. In modern Istanbul, the echoes are everywhere. When sunlight strikes the minarets, it casts shadows that resemble the outlines of vanished bell towers. When the call to prayer drifts across the Golden Horn, it weaves itself into the same air that once carried the hymns of Byzantine choirs. Streets wind through districts where ancient foundations lie just beneath the pavement, their shapes guiding the modern world without revealing themselves. People walk unknowingly over roads emperors once crossed, markets merchants once filled, plazas where ceremonies unfolded under the watchful eyes of 1,000 years. Nothing here has been erased, only layered. Every stone carries two histories. Every doorway holds two identities. Istanbul lives as both the child of empire and the heir to empire, a place where the past is not a chapter closed, but a presence that stands quietly beside each new generation. The Byzantine world may no longer rule, but its fingerprints remain pressed into the heart of the city. Outside Turkey, the memory continues its slow ripple across continents. Writers still speak of the Queen of Cities. Pilgrims and historians travel great distances to stand where the ancient ramparts once stood. In art, literature, and longing, Constantinople exists as a symbol not simply of loss, but of endurance, transformation, and the haunting beauty of civilizations that refuse to disappear completely. Some cities are built of stone, others are built of memory. Constantinople was both, and that is why it endures. Its fall marked an ending, but its echo became a beginning, shaping languages, influencing nations, and whispering across time that even in ruin, something can remain alive. And now, we move to the final reflection on this story. The role of this city as a bridge not only between continents, but between eras, beliefs, and the many worlds history leaves behind. Some cities are crossroads by geography, but Constantinople became a crossroads by destiny. Long before its walls crumbled and long after its banners changed, the city lived as a place where worlds converged. Cultures brushed against each other in its markets. Religions echoed through its streets. Empires wove their ambitions into its foundations. When it fell, it did not descend into darkness. It transformed, absorbing, adapting, and carrying forward pieces of every civilization that touched its shores. Under Byzantine rule, the city held the echoes of Rome, Greece, and early Christendom. Its churches shimmered with gold mosaics that captured the light like fragments of heaven. Scholars translated ancient texts, blending classical thought with spiritual vision. Every stone seemed to speak in multiple tongues. When the Ottomans claimed the city, they did not erase what came before. They layered their own voice upon the old, adding minarets beside domes, calligraphy beside mosaics, new customs beside ancient rituals. Istanbul became a living palimpsest, a manuscript written and rewritten across centuries, each era leaving faint traces beneath the next. The result was not confusion, but harmony, a blending of influences that turned the city into something larger than any empire could contain. Here, cultures did not merely coexist, they conversed. Venetian merchants bargained with Turkish craftsmen, Greek sailors shared harbors with Arab traders. Armenian, Jewish, and Balkan communities carved out their own districts, each adding a melody to the city's chorus. In Istanbul, identity was not a single note, but a chord, rich, layered, and enduring. This is why the city never truly belonged to one world or one time. It stood between continents, between religions, between visions of the past and dreams of the future. Even today, a person can walk from one neighborhood to the next and feel history shifting under their feet. Roman arches beside Ottoman fountains, Byzantine walls shadowed by modern tram lines. Every era remains present, even in silence. The story of Constantinople is not a tale of replacement, but of continuity. Empires rose and fell, but the city carried on, gathering their legacies into a single, unbroken breath. And now, as we reach the final step of this journey, the last section asks a quieter question. What can we, modern people, living far from ancient walls, learn from the rise, the fall, and the transformation of this unforgettable city? The fall of Constantinople is often remembered as a clash of armies, a turning of eras, or a shift in global power. But beneath the battles and dates lies something deeper, a set of quiet lessons that speak not only to nations long gone, but to anyone willing to listen. Great cities fall for the same reasons people stumble: the belief that what once protected them will always be enough, the reluctance to change, and the comfort found in familiar illusions. If the story of Byzantium teaches anything, it is that strength without adaptation becomes fragile, and certainty without reflection becomes dangerous. For centuries, Constantinople trusted its walls. They had saved the city so many times that their strength became a myth. Yet as the world transformed, the empire remained anchored to old strategies, unaware that time had rewritten the rules. The lesson is clear: what worked yesterday may not work tomorrow. Survival demands the willingness to evolve, to question assumptions, to see beyond the comfort of tradition. Another truth lies in leadership. Constantine XI carried the weight of a dying world with quiet dignity, while Mehmed II shaped a rising one with restless vision. Their stories remind us that leadership is not about titles or victories, but about clarity, the ability to recognize the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. Empires collapse when leaders cling to fading memories instead of confronting changing realities. Power, too, reveals its fragility. Constantinople stood for 1,000 years, yet it fell in a single dawn. That contrast is not meant to frighten, but to illuminate. Even the greatest structures depend on the choices, innovations, and adaptability of those who maintain them. Without renewal, strength becomes sculpture impressive, but unmoving. And perhaps the gentlest lesson of all is the persistence of memory. The city fell, but its influence never vanished. Cultures preserved its echoes. Nations carried its stories. Istanbul rose upon its bones. What truly lasts is not the fortress or the throne, but the ideas and adaptations that follow. In the soft light of history, Constantinople becomes more than a fallen giant. It becomes a mirror, reflecting the patterns that shape both civilizations and lives. And so, in the final section, we step back from walls and empires, ending this journey in quiet wonder with the lingering truth that nothing truly ends, only changes. In the quiet hours before dawn, on the 29th of May, 1453, the world did not yet know it was changing. The stars hung over Constantinople as they had for centuries, watching a city that believed it had seen every storm time could offer. But that night, as cannons smouldered and torches flickered along shattered walls, history turned a page so quietly that no one could fully grasp the magnitude of what was unfolding. When the sun finally rose, it illuminated not simply the ruins of an ancient empire, but the beginning of a new world. The fall did not belong solely to Byzantium or to the Ottomans. Its impact travelled farther than those narrow streets and broken ramparts. It reshaped the dreams of nations, redirected the flow of trade, and pushed explorers toward unknown oceans. It altered the balance of faith, power, identity, and imagination. A single night, filled with fear and fire, carried consequences that would echo across continents for centuries. From that moment, Europe began searching for new horizons, leading to discoveries that redefined maps and rewrote human understanding. The Ottoman Empire stepped into its golden age, blending cultures, beliefs, and traditions into a vibrant new chapter. The Orthodox world carried the memory of its fallen capital like an ember kept alive in the dark. And Istanbul, rising from the bones of Constantinople, became a bridge not between two powers, but between eras. The fall of the city revealed something timeless. History does not move in straight lines. It bends, circles, collapses, and renews. Civilizations fade, but their stories continue, carried by those who inherit their ruins and their wisdom. Constantinople's end was not a disappearance. It was a transformation, a handoff between worlds. In the soft stillness of late night, when the mind drifts and the heart listens, the truth becomes clear. The The city did not die in a single night. It changed form. It shifted shape. It stepped from one world into another, leaving behind a legacy that continues to shape how we live, believe, and understand ourselves. And so the story ends here not with silence, but with an echo that reminds us that endings are rarely final, and that every fall contains the seed of a new beginning.